He was a Navy SEAL searching for peace in a world that had only offered him war. But on a night of blinding snow, he found something that froze his soul. A dedicated police officer and her loyal K-9 partner lay bound in the snow, wounded and left for dead. A chilling note promised a final, brutal end. Their breaths were fading in the storm, and their only hope was the man who had come to the flatlands of Ohio to escape the very violence that had just found his doorstep. The town of Havenwood, Ohio, presented two faces to the world. There was the postcard face, a charming small town with brightly painted storefronts on its historic main street, their windows displaying handmade quilts and farm-to-table cafe menus. It was a haven for city dwellers wanting a taste of the rustic life without any of its real dangers. Then there was the other face, the one Caleb Reed knew. It was in the bitter wind that swept across the frozen cornfields, a wind that carried the scent of cold earth, ice, and an unforgiving chill. It was in the deep, silent woods that began where the paved roads ended, a wilderness that didn't care about your bank account or your job title. It was this second face that had drawn him here. For a Navy SEAL on a rare 30-day leave, silence was the mission. Decompress, reset, forget the noise of the Middle East and the humid oppression of the Horn of Africa. Caleb Reed was a man built for purpose. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a lean, corded frame, he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard discipline. His hair was cut short, a dark brown that matched his watchful eyes, and his face was all angles, softened only slightly by the stubble of a day's growth. He was 34, but what he had seen had etched a timeless gravity into his expression. Tonight, the wind was no longer moaning. It had begun to roar. The sky had turned to bruised steel, heavy with the promise of a blizzard. The local news was calling the storm of the decade. Caleb moved around the outside of his small, isolated farmhouse, his actions precise and unhurried. He checked the storm shutters, latched the door to the woodshed, and ran a hand along the frame of the generator housing. Everything in its place, ready. He was about to head inside for the last time when a flicker of instinct, a primal sense of rawness, made him pause. His mission here was peace, but his training never slept. He grabbed a high-powered flashlight from a hook by the door, its familiar weight solid in his hand, and cast its beam into the swirling, thickening snow. He was making one last sweep for firewood, ensuring he had enough to ride out the storm without having to venture out again. The beam cut a white tunnel through the chaotic dance of flakes. The trunks of oak trees stood like silent sentinels, a familiar fence row, a fallen log he'd been chopping on yesterday. Everything was as it should be, almost. He swept the light back, slower this time. There, a dark shape, half buried in a drift near the edge of his property line, where the woods met the fields. It was too small to be a fallen tree, too still to be a deer hunkering down against the storm. He felt the familiar cold slide down his spine as his mind shifted from civilian to soldier. His posture straightened, his senses sharpening to a razor's edge. He moved toward the shape, his boots sinking deep into the new snow, the only sound his own steady breath against the howling wind. As he got closer, the flashlight's beam revealed the impossible. It wasn't one shape, but two. The first was a woman. She was on her side, her face as pale as the snow it rested against. Dark hair was matted with ice against her forehead. She was wearing the remnants of police tactical gear, torn and stained with something dark that was freezing to the ground beneath her. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with a thick rope. Beside her, a magnificent German shepherd was in the same state. The dog, a powerful male with a sable and black coat, was also bound, its legs lashed together. Even unconscious, its body was angled protectively toward the woman, a silent testament to a bond that even this brutality couldn't break. As the light passed over the animal, a weak growl rumbled in its chest. A spark of defiance still burned in the embers of its consciousness. Caleb let out a sharp breath, a plume of white in the frigid air. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, for the glint of a scope, for any sign of an ambush. Nothing. The storm was their cover. Then he saw it. Pinned to the rough bark of an oak tree just above them was a folded piece of paper, stiff with ice. He carefully worked it free. The writing inside was a raw, angry scrawl in black marker. "This is what happens to cops who don't listen." The words hung in the air, a declaration of savage intent. Caleb looked from the note back to the two figures. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a message, an execution left for the impersonal cruelty of nature to finish. The knots on the ropes were professional, efficient. He knew them. He'd been taught how to tie them and how to escape them. The chill in his gut hardened to a block of ice. His leave was over. He knelt, pulling a fixed-blade knife from a sheath on his boot. The steel was cold against his fingers. He had no time for analysis, only action. Hypothermia was a faster killer than blood loss. He went to the dog first. A tactical choice. A wounded, disoriented animal could be a danger to everyone. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I'm here to help." He sliced through the thick ropes binding the dog's legs. The dog, who he would later learn was named Titan, stirred weakly but didn't resist. Next, he turned to the woman. He carefully worked the blade under the ropes on her wrists, the fibers parting with a clean slice. The skin beneath was bruised and swollen. Her name, he would learn, was Kate. She was an officer with the Havenwood Police Department, but right now she was just a life fading in the snow. He checked her pulse. It was there, a faint, thready beat under his fingertips. Her breathing was dangerously shallow. He looked back toward the faint lights of his farmhouse, then at the two victims. He couldn't carry them both at once. The snow was already past his ankles and getting deeper. The wind whipped at him, stealing his breath. He made his decision. He stripped off his heavy winter coat and draped it over Kate. Then he carefully scooped the big German Shepherd into his arms. The dog was heavy, easily 90 pounds, but Caleb had carried wounded men through worse. The dog's head lolled against his shoulder, its breath a faint cloud on his neck. He trudged through the snow, each step a fight against the drifts and the wind. He reached his truck, an old but reliable Ford, and gently placed Titan on a wool blanket in the back seat. He covered him with another before turning and jogging back into the storm. Kate was where he'd left her, a small mound slowly being erased by the falling snow. He knelt, slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than the dog, but felt infinitely more fragile. "Hang on," he muttered into the wind. "Not tonight." He carried her back to the truck, his own body now feeling the biting cold without his coat. He gently laid her on the seat next to her canine partner, rearranging the blanket to cover them both. For a moment, the unconscious woman and her dog rested against each other. Partners, united even at the edge of death. Caleb slammed the door, circled to the driver's side, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The heater rattled, then began to blast out warm air. The headlights cut a desperate path through the blizzard as he navigated the short, treacherous distance back to his farmhouse. He brought them inside one at a time, placing Titan on a thick rug by the fireplace and Kate on the worn leather couch. The farmhouse, once his sanctuary from the world's violence, now smelled of wet fur, pine smoke, and the faint, metallic scent of blood. He worked with practiced efficiency, retrieving his advanced first aid kit, warm water, and clean towels. As he cut away Kate's torn jacket to assess her wounds, he kept glancing at the window. Beyond the glass, the world had disappeared into a white vortex. Whoever had left that note, whoever had done this, was still out there. He went to the door, slid the heavy deadbolt home, and set his shotgun within easy reach of the hearth. The storm was locked out, but Caleb knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard, that he had just let the war in. The world outside the farmhouse ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind and the relentless percussion of snow against the windows. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the drip of melting ice from sodden clothes, and the shallow, unsteady breathing of two unexpected guests. Caleb worked in the warm glow of the lamplight, his focus absolute. The living room had become a makeshift emergency room. He'd removed Kate's soaked, torn uniform jacket and shirt, covering her with thick wool blankets. Her skin was dangerously cold to the touch, her lips tinged with blue. Hypothermia was his first enemy. He examined her injuries with a practiced eye. A deep gash on her forehead was bleeding sluggishly. Her right shoulder was dislocated, the unnatural angle obvious even beneath the skin. Dark, ugly bruises were already starting to form on her ribs and jaw. This wasn't a quick attack. This was a beating, an interrogation. He cleaned the cut on her head with antiseptic from his kit. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were instruments of war. He left the shoulder alone. Trying to set it without knowing the extent of other injuries was a risk he wouldn't take. He then turned his attention to Titan. The big shepherd's breathing was labored. Caleb found a clean but deep gash along his flank, likely a graze from a bullet, red and angry. He cleaned it as best he could, the dog whining softly in its unconscious state. Caleb spoke to him in a low, quiet voice, the same tone he used for panicked new recruits on their first night outside the wire. "You're okay, big guy. You're safe now." He was applying a bandage when a loud, firm knock echoed on the front door. Instantly, Caleb froze. His hand went to the shotgun leaning against the hearth. The knock was confident, heavy, not the sound of a lost hiker. His mind raced. They couldn't have tracked him this fast. Not in this storm. He moved silently to the door, peering through the peephole. The person on his porch was bundled in a heavy, dark green parka, a pair of snowshoes strapped to a pack on her back. Snow caked her hood and shoulders. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. Then she pulled back her hood and he let out a slow, controlled breath. It was Sarah Jenkins. She was a local wildlife officer, one of the few people who knew about his secluded farmhouse. Sarah was in her late 20s, with a face that was more capable than beautiful, framed by a thick, practical braid of auburn hair. Her eyes were a clear, steady green, and she had a no-nonsense demeanor that Caleb respected. She was a woman who belonged to the land, and it showed. He slid the deadbolt open. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Bad night for a social call." She stepped inside, stomping the snow from her boots and bringing a blast of cold air with her. "Doing a final check on the properties on North Ridge before the roads become impassable," she explained, her voice clear and strong. "Figured I'd make sure you weren't buried alive." Her gaze then fell on the scene in the room, the unconscious woman on the couch, the wounded dog by the fire, the discarded, bloody clothes. Her friendly expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, professional concern. She didn't gasp or panic. She simply met Caleb's eyes. "What happened?" "Found them in the woods, left for dead," Caleb said simply. There was no time for a longer explanation. "Her shoulders dislocated and she's deeply hypothermic. The dog has a pretty nasty graze on its flank." Sarah dropped her pack and knelt beside Titan without a second's hesitation. "Let me see," she said, her hands already expertly and gently probing the edges of the wound Caleb had just cleaned. The shepherd groaned, and his dark eyes, barely open, flickered toward the couch where Kate lay. Even in his state, his priority was clear. "He's a fighter," Sarah murmured, her focus entirely on the animal. "And fiercely loyal. Hasn't taken his eyes off her." She looked up at Caleb. "My truck is parked a ways down at the trailhead. I've got a full veterinary first aid kit in it. Much better than whatever you have. It's got sutures, clotting agents, and a salve I make myself for infections. Works better than anything you can buy." "You'll never make it there and back in this," Caleb stated. The wind howled, rattling the window panes like an angry fist. "I'll make it," she said with a confidence that allowed no argument. "You keep them warm. Focus on her. I've got him." Before Caleb could object further, she had her hood back up and was slipping out into the blizzard, disappearing into the white fury as if she were a part of it. True to her word, she was back 20 minutes later, a moving mound of snow with a large, weatherproof case in her gloved hands. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were bright with purpose. While Caleb carefully wrapped Kate in heated blankets and elevated her feet, Sarah got to work on Titan. She cleaned the wound again with a sterile solution, her movements quick and sure. "It's clean," she announced. "Bullet went straight through, which is good. No slug to dig out." She applied a thick, herbal-smelling salve before deftly stitching the wound closed. As she worked, she talked, her voice a low counterpoint to the storm. "I've been seeing things the last few months, Caleb. Things that don't add up. We've got poachers, but they're not taking trophies. And there are tire tracks on old service roads. Roads that have been closed for years. Heavy trucks, moving at night." Caleb paused, looking over from the couch. "You reported it?" "Of course," she said with a small, frustrated sigh. "They take the note, say they'll send a patrol, but nothing ever happens. It's like the reports go into a black hole." He nodded slowly, a dark piece of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. A police officer, beaten and left for dead. A message. And now a wildlife officer talking about suspicious activity being ignored by the authorities. When Sarah was finished, she gently wrapped a clean bandage around Titan's torso. The dog's breathing already seemed to have eased. She sat back on her heels, pushing a stray strand of red hair from her face. "He'll be weak, and that leg will be stiff for a while, but he's strong. He'll make it." She then came to look at Kate, her green eyes scanning the woman's pale face. "How is she?" "Her core temperature is coming up, slowly," Caleb reported. "Her pulse is a little stronger, but she hasn't stirred." For the next hour, they worked in a quiet, efficient rhythm. A soldier and a ranger, two people trained to function in a crisis, holding a fragile line against the violence of both man and nature. As the fire roared and crackled, Titan began to stir more. He lifted his head, his dark, intelligent eyes finding Kate on the couch. A low, mournful whine escaped his throat. He tried to push himself up to get to her, but his injured body wouldn't obey. He settled for keeping his head raised, his gaze fixed on her, a silent, unblinking vigil. Sarah placed a gentle hand on the dog's head. "It's okay, hero," she whispered. "She's right here. We'll take care of you both. The bond between them was a tangible thing in the room, a raw, powerful current of loyalty that silenced both Caleb and Sarah. It was a language older than words, a promise that even in the face of death, they would not be alone. The farmhouse was a sanctuary, but a fragile one. And as the storm continued to rage, Caleb knew that when it finally broke, the real battle would have only just begun. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting intensity of the storm outside and the slow, steady rhythm of care within. Caleb and Sarah kept a quiet vigil, a temporary team forged in crisis. The fire was their only clock, its embers glowing and fading like the passage of a long, dark night. It was a moan, soft but sharp with pain, that broke the silence. Both Caleb and Sarah turned toward the couch. Detective Kate Donovan's eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were unfocused, clouded with a deep confusion. She blinked at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, the unfamiliar maps pinned to the walls, the warm flicker of firelight. Her brow furrowed. This wasn't the cold, suffocating darkness of the woods. This wasn't the end. Her gaze swept the room, landing first on Caleb, who stood near the hearth, his large frame silhouetted by the flames. Her eyes widened with instinctual fear, her body tensing. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as a bolt of agony shot through her dislocated shoulder. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice a low, even rumble. He took a half step forward but kept his distance, his hands open and unthreatening. "You're safe here." Her eyes then found Sarah, who sat on a nearby chair, a steaming mug in her hands. Sarah offered a small, reassuring smile. "He's right. You're safe." Kate's breathing was fast and shallow, her gaze dropped to her own body, wrapped in the thick wool blankets, her torn and bloody clothes gone, replaced by a soft, oversized flannel shirt she knew wasn't hers. Her panicked eyes searched the room again, a silent, desperate question in them. A soft whine came from the floor by the fire. Titan, who had been resting, lifted his head. His bandaged body was stiff, but he managed to push himself partly up, his tail giving a single, weak thump against the wood floor. His dark, soulful eyes were locked on her. "Titan," she breathed, her voice a raw, cracked whisper. The sound was a mixture of profound relief and heartbreak. The sight of her loyal partner, wounded but alive, seemed to anchor her to reality. The fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a wave of raw emotion. "We found you both in the storm," Sarah explained gently, getting to her feet. "Caleb brought you here. We've done what we can for your injuries." Kate slowly processed the information, her gaze shifting between the stoic soldier, the kind-faced wildlife officer, and her devoted dog. The pieces began to fit. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a survivor. She finally let her body relax against the cushions, the movement costing her a wince of pain. She accepted the mug of warm ginger tea Caleb offered, her hands trembling as she brought it to her lips. After a few sips, a spark of the woman she had been before the attack returned. The confusion in her eyes sharpened into focus, a hard, intelligent light that spoke of a will that refused to be broken. "My phone," she rasped, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "Did you find a phone?" Caleb and Sarah exchanged a look. "Nothing on you but your clothes and a badge," Caleb said. "No weapon, no phone." Kate closed her eyes, a muscle in her jaw tightening. "Of course not. They took it." She looked at them, her expression now grim with purpose. "You both deserve to know what you've walked into. My name is Kate Donovan. I'm a detective with the Havenwood Police Department." She paused, taking another breath. "Or at least I was. For the last 8 months, I've been deep undercover. My target was a trafficking ring that calls itself the Hinterland Syndicate." At her words, Sarah's eyes widened. "The trucks?" she said, almost to herself. "The ones on the service roads?" Kate nodded, her eyes locking on the wildlife officer. "Exactly. They're not just running drugs. They're moving military-grade weapons and fentanyl. They use the state park backroads like their personal highway, moving product from an out-of-state distributor and breaking it down in Havenwood before it disappears into the rest of the country. It's a ghost network. Perfect logistics." She shifted, the pain a constant reminder of her ordeal. "I was finally getting close. I had everything on that phone. Video recordings, contact lists, delivery schedules, pictures, names of their local distributors. I even had the name of their leader, a man they call Kane." Caleb listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were intent, taking in every detail. He recognized the cold reality in her story. An operative, alone in hostile territory, compromised. "They knew I was coming," Kate continued, her voice dropping, laced with bitter anger. I was on my way to a supposed meet to get the last piece of evidence I needed. It was a setup. They weren't just thugs. They were professionals. Moved like a fire team. They knew exactly where to hit me, where my backup was thin. Her hand went unconsciously to her bruised ribs. They tried to make me talk, give them the password for the phone, tell them who else knew. When I wouldn't, they decided to leave us as a message. Her voice caught for the first time, her gaze shifting to Titan. They shot him right in front of me. They thought he was dead. Then they tied us up and left us for the storm to finish. The farmhouse was silent, save for the crackling fire. The story hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Which means, she said, her voice hard again, there's a leak inside HPD, and a bad one. Someone high enough up to access sealed files, to monitor my movements, and to clear the way for the syndicate's operations. She looked from Caleb to Sarah, her eyes filled with a desperate urgency. That's what you've stumbled into. This isn't just some local gang. This is about deep corruption. And now that they know I'm alive, they won't stop until they finish the job. Caleb crossed his arms over his chest, his stance as solid as the Ohio bedrock outside. They won't find you here, he said. It wasn't a question or a hope. It was a statement. Kate looked at him, truly seeing the quiet, unshakable strength in the man who had saved her. She saw the same determination in Sarah's steady gaze. They were strangers. Yet in this small, fragile sanctuary, surrounded by the fury of the storm, she felt a flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever in the frozen woods. Hope. They took my evidence, she whispered, the fight returning to her voice. But they didn't take my memory. I know their network. I know their methods. It's still in my head. She looked down at her hands, then back at them. I'm not asking for your help. You've done more than enough, but I am asking you to be careful. You're a part of this now, whether you want to be or not. Sarah pulled her chair closer. What the syndicate is doing to our parks, what they did to you and your partner, she said, nodding toward Titan. That's not something I can walk away from. Kate's gaze finally settled on Caleb, the quiet soldier. He hadn't said much, but his actions had spoken volumes. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. In that single gesture, an unspoken alliance was formed. A detective with no one to trust, a wildlife officer who refused to look away, and a soldier who realized the war he'd sought to escape had followed him home. The blizzard broke with the dawn. It didn't retreat, so much as shatter, leaving behind a world remade in crystal and silence. A pale, fragile sun rose over the flat horizon, casting long blue shadows across a landscape buried under a pristine, heavy blanket of snow. The air was sharp and clean, so cold it felt like breathing ice. Inside the farmhouse, a tense quiet reigned. Caleb had spent part of the night setting Kate's dislocated shoulder. The process had been brutal and agonizing, a choice made of necessity, but it had left her drained and pale. She now sat wrapped in blankets by the fire, her arm immobilized in a makeshift sling, her face a mask of exhaustion and grim resolve. She was a detective again, her mind already at a crime scene. We have to go back, she said, her voice low but firm. The snow is a blessing and a curse. It covers their tracks, but it also preserves everything underneath. We have a window before the sun melts it all away. Sarah, who was checking the dressing on Titan's flank, looked up with concern. Kate, you can barely stand. I don't need to stand. I need to see, she countered, her gaze unwavering. Caleb, who was cleaning his shotgun at the small wooden table, looked at her and saw the familiar, unyielding fire of a warrior who refused to be benched. He knew that drive. He respected it. Arguing would be useless. We'll go, he said, giving a decisive nod. But we move on my terms. Stay close. No risks. Titan seemed to understand. He pushed himself to his feet, a pronounced limp in his gait, but his posture was alert. He went to Kate and rested his heavy head on her knee, his dark eyes looking up at her as if to say he was ready. Their journey back to the ambush site was a slow, methodical procession. Caleb took the lead, his movements fluid and silent as he scanned the landscape, his eyes missing nothing. He was no longer just a man on leave. He was a soldier moving through potentially hostile territory. Sarah walked beside Kate, offering a steadying arm. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain ensured they took the safest path. Kate, though leaning heavily on the wildlife officer, was the one truly guiding them, her detective's eyes searching the familiar but now alien landscape. But it was Titan who was truly in his element. To him, the pristine white snow was not a blank canvas. It was a diary written in a language only he could read. His nose was low to the ground, twitching, sampling the millions of scent particles trapped in the freezing air. He ignored the familiar smells of oak, squirrel, and cold stone. He was searching for the lingering stench of adrenaline, gunpowder, and the specific scent of the men who had harmed his partner. "He's onto something," Kate murmured as Titan made a sharp left turn off the path they'd been following. He led them to the base of a large sycamore, its bark scarred and white. There, half obscured by a fresh drift, was a small, dark object. Caleb crouched, using a stick to carefully brush the snow away. It was a spent shell casing. 9mm, Caleb said, examining it without touching it. "Common, but it's a start." Kate's eyes narrowed. They were disciplined. They would have policed their brass. One left behind means they were in a hurry at the end. Titan didn't wait. He was already moving again, pawing at another drift a few yards away. This time, he uncovered a small piece of black industrial tape, its sticky side adhered to a frozen leaf. Caleb carefully collected it with a pair of tweezers from his kit and dropped it into an evidence bag. "This is the same kind they use to seal heavy-duty shipping crates," Kate said, her voice tight. "I've seen rolls of it at a warehouse they use on the edge of town." The connection was a thin thread, but it was there. They were linking the scene directly to the syndicate. Titan's next find was the most critical. He let out a low bark and began digging furiously near the base of the oak where the note had been pinned. Under a few inches of snow was a piece of burlap, stiff with ice. As Caleb lifted it, a harsh, acrid chemical smell hit the air. It was sour with a bitter, metallic undertone. Sarah, who had been watching silently, took a careful sniff. "I've smelled something like that before," she said slowly. "Near an old abandoned chemical plant on the north border of the park. We thought it was just illegal dumping." Caleb's eyes met Kate's. "Cutting agent," he said, his voice grim. "Or a precursor for fentanyl production. They got sloppy. They used this as a gag or a blindfold and just tossed it." They had their evidence, 3 small, seemingly insignificant items that together told a story of professional violence, a hasty departure, and a direct link to the syndicate's operation. As they started back toward the farmhouse, Sarah spread a detailed topographic map on the hood of Caleb's truck. Her finger traced a path with authority. "This is where you were," she said, indicating a spot. "And this," she moved her finger across the map's intricate lines, "is that old service road I told you about. It's less than half a mile from here. It's completely hidden from the main roads. It's a perfect smuggling route." She then tapped the location of the old plant she'd mentioned. "And the plant is right here, at the end of that road, a perfect place to store things, or to cook." Her map connected all the dots, the ambush site, the illegal route, and a potential base of operations. Back in the warmth of the farmhouse, the 3 of them stood around the table, the evidence laid out between them. The fragile hope from the night before was now solidifying into a concrete, terrifying reality. They had the what, the where, and the how. They just didn't have the who. Not for sure. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said quietly, looking at the map. "They aren't just passing through. They've set up shop right in our backyard. And they have someone on the inside protecting them," Kate added, her hand resting on her bandaged arm. "We can't take any of this to the department. We don't know who to trust." She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with a new weight. "That casing, the tape. This is all evidence. But it's useless if we can't get it to the right people." Caleb looked at the small pieces on the table, then at the 2 women beside him. He had come to these flatlands for solitude and an escape from the complexities of war. But war had a way of finding you. And now in this quiet farmhouse, a new unit had been formed. A detective with a score to settle, a wildlife officer protecting her territory, and a soldier who knew you can't run from a fight. "We don't go to them," Caleb said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "We find a way to make them come to us." The day after their grim discovery, the farmhouse transformed into a makeshift command center. Sarah's topographic map was spread across the table, now marked with red circles indicating the ambush site and the abandoned chemical plant. The small evidence bags lay beside it, a sparse collection of clues against a formidable, unseen enemy. "We're operating blind," Kate said, her voice tight but clear. She was pacing the small space, the pain in her shoulder a constant, dull throb. "The warehouse I mentioned, the one with the industrial tape, is our best bet. If they've moved product recently, there might be signs. Fresh tracks, new locks, anything." Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. His mind was already breaking the problem down into a series of tactical objectives. Going in heavy is out. We need intelligence. We go into town, but we don't look like we're looking. We're tourists. Just another couple enjoying the post-storm scenery. He looked at Kate. "Think you can handle it?" A flicker of her old, confident smile touched her lips. "I can play tourist. The walking is the problem." "I'll be your crutch," he said simply. Sarah had her own role. "I know most of the folks who work in the county archives office," she offered. "There's an old-timer there, Hank, who knows every deed and permit filed for the last 40 years. If I ask about land surveys near the plant for a park service project, he might tell me who owns the warehouse without realizing what he's doing." Hank was a talker. His memory was a dusty, disorganized, but surprisingly complete archive of the town's history. The plan was set. Kate changed into a spare set of clothes borrowed from Sarah. Her police-issue boots were the only part of her old life she still wore. Caleb looked every bit the rugged outdoorsman on vacation, his worn jacket and beanie blending in perfectly. Before they left, Caleb knelt in front of Titan, who was resting by the fire. The dog's eyes were bright and alert, and he whined softly at the sight of them preparing to leave. "You've got the watch, big guy," Caleb said, scratching him behind the ears. "Hold the fort. We'll be back." Titan seemed to understand, settling back onto his rug with a resigned sigh, his gaze following them until the cabin door closed. Havenwood was slowly coming back to life. Snowplows had cleared Main Street, creating tall, glittering banks of snow in the sun. Caleb and Kate walked slowly, his arm a subtle support. To any casual observer, they looked like any other couple, slightly hampered by a minor skiing injury. They bought coffee, browsed the window of an outfitter shop, and slowly made their way toward the town's light industrial outskirts. Meanwhile, Sarah walked into the county office, a friendly smile on her face as she greeted Hank, a man with a shock of white hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose. As she'd predicted, a few casual questions about old mining rights were all it took to set him off on a detailed history of the area, which eventually included the fact that the warehouse was owned by a shell corporation with an out-of-state address, but that its local use permit had been personally signed off on by one of the town's most respected officers. Back at the farmhouse, the quiet was broken by Titan. He had rested enough. His wound still ached, but a deeper instinct was stirring, a scent. It was faint, carried on the cold air, a lingering ghost of the men who had attacked them. It was strongest near the back of the cabin, by the old woodshed. He got to his feet, his limp more pronounced after lying still for so long. He padded outside, nose to the ground. The scent was there, mixed with the smell of pine and damp earth, where the snow was thinnest around the shed's foundation. It was the same smell of fear and acrid malice he remembered from the woods. He followed it to a stack of firewood piled against the shed wall. Here it was strongest. Driven by an instinct he didn't understand, he began to dig. His front paws tore at the frozen dirt and snow, ignoring the protest from his injured flank. He clawed away layers of wood chips and frozen soil until his paw struck something that wasn't earth or rock. It was a small, black nylon pouch, its fabric stiff with frost. He clamped his jaws on the strap and with a heave, pulled the bag from its shallow grave and toward the cabin's back porch. When Caleb and Kate returned at dusk, they had confirmed the warehouse showed signs of recent activity. Tire tracks matching the width of the ones Sarah had seen on the service road were visible under a dusting of new snow. Sarah met them with a grim expression. The local permit for that warehouse was fast-tracked, she told them, signed by a lieutenant at HPD, Michael Hansen. Kate froze. Hansen? Her voice was a whisper. Lieutenant Michael Hansen was her direct supervisor. He was charismatic, ambitious, a rising star in the department who had personally recommended her for the undercover assignment. He was the last person she would have ever suspected. Before the weight of that betrayal could fully land, Caleb, who was circling the cabin checking the perimeter, stopped short. "Sarah, Kate, you need to see this." On the back porch was the muddy nylon pouch with a very proud German shepherd sitting beside it. "Titan," Kate breathed, rushing to throw her good arm around her partner's neck. "What did you find?" They brought the bag inside. Caleb handled it carefully with gloves. Inside, sealed in a small plastic case, were a dozen SIM cards and a single, mud-caked USB flash drive. It was a disposable intelligence kit, the kind you use and then ditch. The kind someone gets rid of when they think a job is finished and all the witnesses are dead. Caleb retrieved a ruggedized military laptop from his gear. It was offline, untraceable. He carefully cleaned the flash drive and inserted it into the port. A few tense moments of silence passed. Then the contents of the drive appeared on the screen. It was a treasure trove. Encrypted spreadsheets, shipping manifests, contact lists filled with burner phone numbers. But it was the last file that made the air in the room freeze. It was a series of internal police dispatch logs, patrol routes for the last 6 months. And every single time a major syndicate shipment was scheduled to move through the park, the patrol car assigned to that sector was conveniently rerouted with a last-minute authorization code. Kate leaned closer to the screen, her face pale. That's a supervisor's override code, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Every lieutenant has one. She clicked on the digital signature attached to the overrides. A name and badge number appeared, crisp and clear on the screen. Lieutenant M. Hansen, number 714. That was it, the cold, undeniable proof. The man who had been her mentor, who had pushed her into the lion's den, was the one holding the door open for the lions. The pieces were no longer scattered. They now formed a single, horrifying picture. Sarah sank into a chair, her face grim. Kate stood motionless, the full weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. Caleb looked from the screen to Kate, then to the dog, now lying at her feet, his mission complete. Titan hadn't just found a bag, he had unearthed the viper hiding in the heart of the Havenwood Police Department. And in doing so, he had just made the 3 people in this cabin the most dangerous witnesses in the entire state. The name on the screen, Lieutenant Hansen, hung in the air, colder and more dangerous than the winter night outside. The knowledge of his betrayal settled over them like a shroud. It meant their enemy wasn't just some faceless criminal enterprise. Their enemy had a badge, access, and authority. He knew Kate's face, her methods, and now he would surely know that his attempt to eliminate her had failed. He knows we're alive, Kate said, her voice barely a whisper. The men he sent, when they didn't report back, he'll know. Caleb was already moving. The time for analysis was over. The brief respite he had found in these quiet flatlands was an illusion. He was back in the fight. He doesn't know where we are, he said, his voice low and commanding, instantly cutting through the fear in the room. Not yet, but he'll be looking. We need to be ready. He began a systematic check of the farmhouse. Windows were secured, curtains drawn. He pulled out a small, military-grade satellite phone from his gear. No cell phones. They can be tracked. This is the only way we communicate. As night fell, a new kind of silence settled in. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness, but a tense, watchful silence, heavy with anticipation. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rustle of the wind in the bare trees, sounded like a footstep. The first warning didn't come from a human. It came from Titan. The German shepherd, who had been lying at Kate's feet, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled, pointing toward the dark northern wall of the cabin. A low, deep growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that was more vibration than noise. The fur along his spine stood on end. Caleb, who had been cleaning his rifle, stopped instantly. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Titan got to his feet, his limp forgotten. He moved silently to the back door, pressing his nose to the crack at the bottom, tasting the air. He stared out into the darkness, his body coiled like a spring. He wasn't just hearing something. He was sensing a presence. "They're here," Caleb said, his voice flat and void of emotion. He grabbed the shotgun and handed it to Kate. "You watch the front window. Don't fire unless I do. Sarah, stay away from the windows. Get the medical kit ready." Kate's hand was steady as she took the weapon. Her police training was a familiar anchor in the chaos. Sarah, her face pale but her expression determined, nodded and began laying out bandages and antiseptic on the table. Caleb moved toward the back, but Titan blocked his path. The dog whined, a high, urgent sound, and nudged Caleb's leg with his head, pushing him away from the door and toward the side of the cabin. Then he stared intently at a spot outside near the woodshed, where he'd found the bag. Caleb followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing. He crept to the side window, peering out into the moonlit snow. He saw nothing at first, but Titan's warning was too specific. Caleb knew to trust a trained animal's instincts over his own eyes. He scanned the area again, his gaze tracing the faint shadows, and then he saw it, a thin, almost invisible line, no thicker than a shadow, stretched between a tree and the corner of the woodshed. A tripwire. His eyes followed it to a small dark mass half buried in the snow. A pressure plate-eyed, homemade, but lethal. A cold dread seized him. They had planned to flush them out the back door, straight into a kill zone. Titan had just saved all their lives. "Stay away from the back wall," he ordered in a sharp whisper. "It's booby-trapped." He slipped out the front door like a ghost, melting into the shadows of the porch. He didn't have explosives, but he had a soldier's ingenuity. He moved quickly around the cabin, stretching thin cords between trees, attaching clusters of empty cans he'd been saving for recycling. He dug small pits in the snow, covering them with flimsy branches. They weren't lethal traps. They were alarms, disorienting devices, a way to turn his woods into a confusing, noisy maze for the hunters. He had just set the last line when he heard it. The snap of a twig, too loud to be an animal. He slipped back into the cabin, bolting the door behind him just as the first figures emerged from the tree line. There were 6 of them, moving in a practiced wedge formation. Dark figures in winter gear, rifles at the ready. They were professionals. One of them broke off, circling toward the back of the cabin. His boot snagged the tripwire Caleb had just set. A cascade of rattling cans shattered the night's silence. The man swore, diving for cover. Instantly, the night erupted. Caleb fired a controlled shotgun blast into the tree trunk just above the man's head. The sound was a deafening roar. Wood splintered, forcing the attacker to stay down. From the front window, Kate had a target. Another viper was moving between trees. She fired, the shot precise, kicking up snow inches from his feet, driving him back. The vipers were caught off guard. They had expected scared, sleeping victims, not a coordinated, tactical defense. They returned fire, rounds thudding into the cabin's thick log walls, sending splinters flying. "They're trying to flank us from the west," Caleb yelled, seeing 2 more figures moving through the brush. He grabbed 2 smoke grenades from his kit. "Cover your faces." He pulled the pins and tossed them out the side window. Thick, choking smoke billowed out, obscuring the viper's line of sight. Under the cover of smoke and confusion, he slipped outside again. He moved in a low crouch, a predator in his own territory. One of the attackers, a wiry man with a hawk tattoo on his neck, was trying to get a clear shot through the smoke. He stepped back, right into one of the simple snares Caleb had set. The cord tightened around his ankle, sending him sprawling into the snow with a grunt of pain and surprise. Caleb was on him in a second. The butt of his rifle came down in a hard, disabling strike to the man's shoulder, sending his weapon flying. Before the man could recover, Caleb had him flipped over, his knee in his back, brutally cinching his wrists with a zip tie. He dragged the captured man back toward the cabin. Kate laid down covering fire. Her shots were controlled and deliberate, keeping the other vipers pinned. They tumbled through the door, and Sarah slammed it shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. Their prisoner was gasping, his eyes wide with pain and shock. He was young, maybe mid-20s, his face hardened by a life of violence. He stared at Caleb, then at Kate holding the shotgun, and finally at Titan, who stood over him, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. Outside, the remaining vipers hesitated. Their element of surprise was gone. One of their own was captured. They were facing a far more capable defense than they had anticipated. After a few more sporadic shots, they retreated into the darkness of the woods, disappearing like ghosts. The silence returned, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and smoke. The immediate danger was over. Caleb stood over their prisoner, his face unreadable. Kate leaned against the wall, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Sarah was already moving toward the captured man with the first aid kit, her healer's instinct overriding everything else. They had held the line. They had survived. And now, tied to a chair in the middle of their fragile sanctuary, they had a direct link to the man who wanted them dead. They had a prisoner to question. The smell of gunpowder had been replaced by the stale scent of fear. The captured viper, whose name they learned was Rico, sat zip-tied to a sturdy kitchen chair. He was wiry and tense, his eyes darting between the 3 people watching him. The bravado he might have had with his crew in the woods was gone, replaced by the look of a cornered animal who knows his luck has run out. The interrogation wasn't a brutal affair. Caleb didn't touch him. He didn't have to. He simply stood in front of Rico, arms crossed, his presence and formidable power doing the work. He projected an aura of complete calm and lethal capability that was more terrifying than any overt threat. "We know who you work for," Kate began, her voice cool and steady. She stood off to the side, her injured arm in its sling, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "We know about the shipments. We know about the warehouse." Rico spat on the floor. "I don't know anything." Caleb said nothing. He just watched, letting the silence stretch. In the quiet of the cabin, with the memory of the failed siege still fresh, silence was its own form of pressure. "We also know about Lieutenant Hansen," Kate said, dropping the name like a stone. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Rico's face. He visibly flinched. Mentioning the gang was one thing. Naming the corrupt cop was another. It meant they knew how deep the rot went. "Hansen's your protection," Kate pressed, driving the advantage. "He clears the way for you, erases your tracks. But what happens when we give his name to the feds? He's going to burn everyone to save himself. And the first person he'll burn is the guy who failed to silence the witnesses." She let that sink in. "He'll give you up, Rico. He'll say you were the leader of the assault. He'll sacrifice you to save his own skin." The man's jaw worked silently. He looked at Caleb, then back at Kate, and he saw no mercy, but he did see an opening. "What do you want?" he finally rasped. "A name," Caleb said, speaking for the first time. His voice was a low rumble. "The man at the top, the one Hansen answers to." Rico hesitated for a long moment, then he slumped in the chair, the fight draining out of him. "Kane," he muttered. "They call him Kane. He runs the whole territory. Hansen's just his pet cop." The name Kane, the one Kate had heard whispered during her undercover work, now had a face, a structure, and a direct link to the law. "We have what we need," Kate said to Caleb, turning her back on the prisoner. She moved to the table where Caleb's satellite phone lay. "There's one person I trust. He works for the DEA. He's the reason I took this assignment in the first place." She looked at Caleb. "I need to make this call." Caleb nodded, handing her the phone. He understood the need for a trusted ally outside their immediate circle. Kate dialed a number from memory. After a few tense rings, a man's voice, sharp and alert, answered. "Donovan." "David, it's me," Kate said, her voice cracking with an emotion she hadn't shown until now. On the other end of the line was Special Agent David Donovan of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He was her older brother, a man with a lean, intense face and the same stubborn jawline as his sister. His life's work was taking down organizations like the Syndicate, and his greatest fear had always been the danger his sister put herself in. "Kate, my God, where are you? You dropped off the grid 2 days ago. We thought." "I'm alive, David. I'm okay," she said, cutting him off before he could finish. "Listen to me. I don't have much time. I was compromised. Hansen is dirty. He's been feeding intel to the Syndicate." She quickly explained the situation, her voice low and urgent. "I'm sending you a data packet. Everything I had, plus what we've found since. It's all there. The network, the names, the proof against Hansen. Stay put." David's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Do not move. Don't trust anyone. I'll get a team, but I have to do this off book. If Hansen has eyes and ears in the department, he could get tipped off. Give me coordinates." After sending the encrypted file and the location, Kate ended the call. The weight on her shoulders seemed to lift, just slightly. They weren't alone anymore. As she finished the call, Sarah, who had been checking on Titan, spoke up. "The firefight aggravated his wound. He needs proper medical attention, Caleb. Stitches and antibiotics I don't have. He's running a fever." Kate looked at her partner and her heart ached. Titan was panting, his eyes glazed with fever. "She's right," Kate said. "We have to get him help, but we can't take him to a local vet. Hansen could have them watched." "I know a place," Sarah said immediately. "An old vet who lives deep in the valley, a friend of my grandfather's. He's off-grid, trusts the government about as far as he can throw it. He asks no questions. I can get Titan there. He'll be safe, and he'll get the care he needs." The decision was made. A quiet farewell passed between Kate and her dog. She knelt, pressed her forehead to his, and whispered promises to him. "Be strong, boy. I'm coming back for you." Titan licked her hand weakly, his tail giving a single thump. Sarah gently led him toward her truck, leaving Caleb and Kate alone with their prisoner and their plan. With the data now in the hands of the DEA, their objective had shifted. It was no longer about survival. It was about ending this. "Rico," Caleb said, turning back to the prisoner. "Your boss, Kane. When's the next big shipment?" Afraid and seeing a chance to save himself, Rico talked. He told them about a major delivery of fentanyl precursors scheduled for 2 nights from now. It was happening at the old abandoned chemical plant Sarah had identified on her map. It was the Syndicate's main storage and processing hub. A plan began to form. A dangerous gamble built on their new intelligence. "David and his team won't get here in time to set up a full-scale raid without tipping off Hansen," Kate analyzed. "We need to control the board." "Then we change the game," Caleb said, his eyes glinting with a strategic light. "We leak new intel, something that sounds credible, something Hansen will hear about." Sarah's map was their battlefield. "We can use one of the burner sims," Kate suggested. "Send a text to a number on Kane's contact list. A fake tip about a rival crew planning to hijack the shipment. We make them nervous," Caleb continued, seizing the idea. "And we give them a solution. We suggest a new, more secure location for the meet." He pointed to a spot on the map Sarah had marked earlier, a narrow, isolated quarry with only one way in and one way out. "A perfect trap. A place of our choosing. We lure Kane and his inner circle there," Kate finished, her voice laced with dangerous resolve. And if we can make Hansen believe his whole operation is at risk, he'll show up too. To personally oversee his investment. It was a sting of their own making, a plan to use the enemy's own network against them, to draw the snakes out of their den and into a trap. With Sarah on her way to secure the safety of their most loyal ally, Caleb and Kate began to prepare for the final move. The farmhouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a staging ground for a war. The air in the quarry was still and cold. Under a star-dusted, moonless sky, the rock walls rose on either side like black teeth, creating a narrow corridor with no escape. It was a perfect trap. Caleb lay prone on a high ledge, a suppressed rifle resting on his pack, his eyes scanning the quarry floor through a night vision scope. He was a ghost in the gloom, utterly still, a part of the rock and shadow. Below, Kate was positioned behind a cluster of boulders near the quarry's entrance. A pistol was held steady in her good hand. She wasn't alone. With her were two others in dark tactical gear. Her brother, Agent David Donovan, had arrived an hour before with a small, elite DEA team. David was all business, his movements sharp and efficient, but the look he'd given his sister was one of fierce, protective pride. He and his team had established a blocking position at the far end of the quarry, ready to spring the trap. They didn't have to wait long. The distant sound of engines grew to a low rumble. Two heavy-duty trucks, their headlights off, navigated the treacherous service road and rolled into the mouth of the quarry before coming to a stop. Men began to jump out, their movements disciplined. From the lead truck, two figures emerged. One was tall and wiry with a cruel mouth and the cold, lifeless eyes of a predator. Caleb didn't need to be told this was Kane. The second was Lieutenant Michael Hansen. He was still wearing a tactical jacket, but tonight it looked more like the costume of a traitor than a uniform. His charismatic smile was gone, replaced by a tense, greedy expression. Then the back doors of the second truck opened. A man pulled out three children, their faces pale with fear in the dim light. They were no older than 12, each clutching a small, heavy duffel bag. The syndicate was using them as mules, a horribly effective shield against interdiction. Go! David's voice whispered over their encrypted comms. The deal was about to go down when the signal was given. Blinding floodlights erupted from both ends of the quarry, turning night into day. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Federal agents, drop your weapons. You are surrounded. Chaos erupted. Kane and his men opened fire, their automatic weapons spitting orange sparks into the darkness. Hansen, his face a mask of rage and panic, did the unthinkable. He lunged for the nearest child, a small girl, and yanked her in front of him as a shield. Stay back! He screamed, his pistol pressed to her head. I'll kill her. The DEA agents froze. The firefight faltered. Hansen started backing away, dragging the crying child with him. It was in that moment that a new sound cut through the chaos. A deep, powerful bark echoed from the ridge above the quarry entrance. Standing there, silhouetted against the lights, was Sarah, and beside her, poised and ready, was Titan. Caleb had called her on the sat phone. It was a risk, but one he had to take. Sarah, true to her nature, hadn't hesitated. The old vet had worked miracles. Titan was recovered, his limp nearly gone, his body a coiled spring of muscle and loyalty. Titan! Kate yelled, her voice filled with anguish for both her partner and the child. No. But the dog was already moving. He launched himself from the ridge, a black and sable missile of righteous fury. He landed with a thud and charged, ignoring the bullets that kicked up dust around him. He didn't attack blindly. His eyes, burning with intelligence, were locked on a single target, Hansen. The corrupt lieutenant turned, surprised by the new threat. That moment of hesitation was all it took. Titan slammed into him, not biting, but using his full weight to drive Hansen away from the girl. The lieutenant staggered back, losing his grip. The child scrambled to safety. Hansen raised his pistol to shoot the dog, but he was too slow. A single, precise shot from Caleb's rifle on the ridge above sent the handgun flying from his grasp. In the same instant, Kate charged forward, her injured arm screaming in protest as she tackled Hansen to the ground, the satisfying click of handcuffs echoing through the quarry. Seeing their leaders fall, the remaining syndicate members surrendered. The trap had closed. Weeks later, the snow in Havenwood had begun to melt, revealing the first patches of green on the forest floor. The town felt lighter, as if a long shadow had finally been lifted. At a solemn ceremony at the town hall, Kate, her arm now free of its sling, stood tall as her badge was officially reinstated. Her brother David pinned a commendation for valor to her clean, crisp uniform, the pride in his eyes for all to see. The children she had saved sat in the front row with their families, a living testament to her sacrifice. Caleb wasn't there. His own commendation from Naval Special Warfare Command arrived in a sealed, classified folder. He read it, filed it away, and said nothing. His reward was the quiet knowledge of a job well done. Sarah, however, was in the spotlight. With the massive assets seized from the Hinterland Syndicate's operation, a federal grant was approved to fund the construction of the Havenwood Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Center, with Officer Sarah Jenkins named as its director. Her dream, born from a life of loving the land, was finally coming true. That afternoon, the four of them met on a hillside overlooking the town. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and thawing earth. Caleb leaned against a tree, a rare, relaxed smile on his face. Kate stood beside him, her posture confident and serene. Sarah had a roll of blueprints tucked under her arm, her eyes bright with excitement for the future. And at their feet, sitting proudly, was Titan. A new, custom-made K9 collar with a small silver medal hung around his neck. He looked from Kate to Caleb, then to Sarah, his tail thumping a slow, happy rhythm against the ground. "Look at that," Sarah said softly, gazing down at the valley. "It feels different now. Safer." "That's what justice feels like," Kate replied, bending down to scratch Titan behind the ears. She looked up at Caleb, her expression filled with a gratitude that words couldn't capture. "You came here looking for peace and quiet. I'm sorry we took that from you." Caleb shook his head, his gaze meeting hers. "I learned that peace isn't a place you find," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It's a place you make. And we made it." They stood together in a comfortable silence. A soldier, a cop, a ranger, and a hero dog. An unlikely team bound by a storm of violence, who had found not just justice, but a shared strength and a new dawn for the town they all, in their own ways, called home.